Well, welcome everyone to CG seminar number 158. And it's great to see everyone here. We're once again looking at international education, and this time we have Jenna Mittelmeier and Sylvie Lomer to take us through the issues. I'll introduce them in a moment, but let me move quickly to the web protocols, which some of you will have heard before. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website in due course. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function and write the question out there that you wish to ask. We will then select from the set of questions and compose the Q&A session accordingly. So it's a good idea to ask your question relatively early during the hour, ideally towards the end of the speaker's presentation in the first 30 minutes, because you're most likely then to be able to enter the Q&A session. Questions that come in the last 5 or 10 minutes often miss out. Now, when you're invited to ask your question, please unmute yourself. Most important, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. Now, let me bring in our substantive discussion for the day. Are we going to have the speakers in the order that we've listed them, Sylvie and Jenna, in that order?
We'll kind of share back and forth today.
Okay, I'll introduce you both at the start. Sylvie Lomer is lecturer in policy and practice and founding co-convener of the Higher Education Research Network. That's actually Jenna, not Sylvie, on screen at the moment, at the Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. Hotbed of the pandemic, or one of the 120 pandemic sites in the UK in higher education at the moment. We're all very worried about what's happening, and especially we know that there are major issues in Manchester, which will no doubt come up during the session. Sylvie's an established researcher in international higher education studies. I had the honour of serving on her doctoral examination committee with brilliant thesis, published as a book, and she subsequently published a number of papers from there and also elsewhere in her research. Jenna Mittelmeier, who you can see on screen at the moment, is a lecturer in international education at the Manchester Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. Her area of research expertise focuses on international students' transition experiences and broader aspects of internationalisation, both of them significant emerging researchers. Probably emerged is probably a better description, already contributing in a major way to the discussion of internationalisation in the UK and worldwide, and we really welcome them both today. So, are you going to start, or will Sylvie? Okay, fire away. Yep. The floor is yours, or should we say the screen is yours?
Thanks very much, Simon. Sylvie will just share her screen here in a second. But thanks very much for that introduction and for having us today. So as Simon said, my name is Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm a lecturer in international education at the University of Manchester. I'm joined with my colleague Sylvie. If you want to give a small wave, she should be on the screen as well. But we'll be talking today about our project, Pedagogies of Internationalization. It's a year-long project that's currently we're about at the halfway point at this stage. And it's been generously funded by the Society for Research into Higher Education. So I did just want to give them a short shout out at the start. Sylvie, if you wouldn't mind going to our first slide. I'll start first by giving just a little bit of a rationale for the research and going through some of our overall aims, and then we'll jump into a few of the preliminary findings from our first two studies. So the original idea for this project came primarily from recognizing that pedagogies in particular are often ignored in the discussions about internationalization. which we felt was a major gap in the literature and in our knowledge about evidence-based teaching practices with international students. So there's quite a lot of research that focuses on things like international student mobility or international students' transition experiences more broadly, but not a lot of work that focuses specifically on perspectives of pedagogy and questions about how internationalization shapes our teaching practices. And we felt that omission was really unfortunate because there seems to be kind of an assumption that mobility somehow magically equates to a meaningful intercultural experience. And in fact, I think that's the way many of our universities are marketed, as these inclusive international learning spaces. But we felt that this wasn't something that occurred automatically just by the presence of international students, but rather through the more purposeful decisions made by lecturers in developing more inclusive teaching approaches. But at the same time, we felt that those inclusive teaching approaches hadn't been very well evidenced in a systematic way. And we felt that there was a lot that remains unknown about what lecturers actually do to practically facilitate international and intercultural learning, again, beyond just the presence of international students. And within that, we felt that there was a real question here about ethics and inclusivity. So thinking about, thinking beyond just bringing international students into our classroom and thinking about to what extent are they treated as epistemic equals? And then kind of conversely, to what extent are international students being exploited for the supposed contribution that they are expected to make for the benefit of home students through, assumptions about sharing diverse perspectives or offering a window to the world, as we might call it. And then also things like, are international students instead being treated through the lens of a deficit narrative, such as by being assumed to lack certain fundamental skills or lack certain knowledges compared to home students. Next slide, please, Sylvie. So that takes us to the overarching aims of our project. First, we wanted to start to systematically map that evidence that exists about pedagogic practices with international students. And we focus for this project specifically in the UK, although I think with more time and funding, we would love to expand that to more international comparisons. But we'll talk specifically about the UK today. But we wanted to answer questions like, how are international students being taught in the UK, and what evidence do we have so far about pedagogies of working with international students? And then secondly, kind of a second aim was we wanted to understand whether and how the presence of international students shapes our teaching practices in UK higher education. So we wanted to kind of explore the extent to which lecturers are innovating, adapting, or retaining pedagogic practices in response to the presence of international students within their classrooms. Yeah, next slide again, Sylvie. So our project includes 3 key stages. We've completed most of stage 1, are in the process of stage 2 at the moment. So we'll talk through the preliminary findings from both of these shortly. Stage 1 was a systematic literature review about published research related to pedagogies with international students in the UK. And Sylvie is going to go into a deeper dive into that in just a moment. But then stage 2 followed up looking beyond the published research to look at kind of the unpublished evidence through interviews with lecturers across the different disciplines to understand, what was their approach to teaching international students and how the presence of international students impacted on their teaching practices. And then the final stage we'll talk about at the end. We have a project website where we're presently working on developing a searchable bank of case studies about teaching approaches with international students, which we are hoping will serve as a resource for lecturers in the future. But we'll talk about that more in the end in case anyone here today is interested in getting involved. But I'll pass back over to Sylvie now.
Okay. Thanks, Jenna. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about how we did the systematic literature review and what our key findings were. Just to refer back to the aims, what we're trying to do with the systematic literature review is to establish what, if any, is the knowledge base about pedagogies that lecturers might be referring to and picking up on in their own practice. So what we were hoping to do was compile multiple studies that we could synthesize in order to make recommendations, not necessarily for best practice, but for a range of different practices that could be adapted to different disciplinary and institutional contexts. So we started off with a systematic review looking for looking in the Manchester Library, through ProQuest, Web of Science, British Education Index, and then we did a cross-check in a second stage through individual publishers' websites. We were looking for the keywords that mentioned either pedagogy, classroom, teaching, curriculum, or assessment, plus the UK, international students specifically, and higher education. We focused on the keyword international students rather than broader concepts of internationalising the curriculum, because we feel this is what's been neglected in the literature to date, is an explicit recognition of the bodies of international students in our classrooms or subscribed to our online courses, and the influence that that has on the pedagogies and teaching practices adopted. So we were looking for anything published in a peer-reviewed journal. We did also intend to have a stage of reviewing the grey literature, but this proved to be very challenging because, of course, there's no real indexing. So Jenna spent a lot of time scraping individual universities and different institutions' websites, and what we've found is that it's really disparate, very hard to identify. So we've pressed pause on the grey literature survey, but we are aware there will be lots of additional data there. And we're going to try to resource a proper systematic approach to that. We wanted to look for data that was collected at least partially in the UK. Again, this was an initial assumption of our study, is that the geographical and the national context, and particularly the policy context, which is the direction I come at this from, would shape the pedagogies and practices. That's an assumption that I'm not sure in light of our current data actually holds true, but it was a starting point for our literature review at least. We were looking for empirical data on teaching practices, whether qualitative, quantitative, anecdotal, as long as there was some information about what actually happened in the classroom, we included it. We didn't impose any quality criteria beyond that. And they had to mention international students at some point in the participants, the methodology, the rationale, the design, somewhere. And we set publication dates between 2013, which was the publication of the previous international education strategy from the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, again on the assumption that there is some form of interaction between policy and practice in the higher education sector. So we identified over 3,000 articles for immediate review. We excluded those from the title that were clearly theoretical, based in other countries, irrelevant. It's astounding, by the way, just as a side note, how ineffective a lot of these search mechanisms really are. They're a mystery to me. And it reminds me, I think, to be sympathetic to our students when they do struggle to find relevant literatures, because it's a process. So we stored about a third of those for further review, checked the abstracts. If we couldn't make a decision on the abstract, we checked the full text. And we ended up with actually only 48, which we were both surprised about and felt was a fairly small number compared to what we anticipated. So from there, we did a full analysis and looked at their methodologies, their findings, and what we could synthesize in terms of the learning design, teaching approaches, pedagogies, with particular relevance to international students. So a quick overview, a lot of the literature is coming from the business field, not a surprise, that's where the majority of international students are in the UK. But it does suggest that there is space in the literature for specific disciplinary explorations with international students in other contexts. The vast majority are single site case studies. This is probably typical, although I don't quite feel qualified to comment, of the pedagogical literature as a whole, but it does raise concerns about the methodological validity and the transferability of the findings. Typically, although this is often not explicitly stated, we're looking at the researcher's own classroom and a reflection on their own practice. A lot of them focused on PGT, so postgraduate teaching, for those who aren't familiar with the UK acronyms. Again, that broadly reflects the distribution of international students in the UK. Several also mixed levels and talked about experimentations in both undergraduate and postgraduate classrooms. So in terms of the pedagogies, this slide gets very complicated, so I've split it into two. These are the main clusters of pedagogies that we identified. Along the bottom, I'll start with these, are the ones where we only found one or at best two articles discussing them. You might be surprised to see that internationalising curricular content, for example, making the reading list more diverse, including international case studies, is on that bottom rung. Placements or work-based projects, we found one. There's one on theatre-based pedagogy, one on communicative language teaching, one on employability. So you can start to see here that we're really experiencing a challenge of being able to synthesize, because the evidence on work-based learning or placements with international students is very limited. There's one that meets our criteria. So we can't do any form of synthesis on that. All we can do is report it and say, these guys tried something, they think it worked. So I'll move on now and show you the ones that have more conceptual richness. These include, which is probably not a surprise, intercultural group work, assessment, technology-enhanced practices, various interpretations of student-centered approaches, and academic literacy. On the next slide, you'll see where we continue to have a problem with synthesizing, even in these broader categories. Because once you break down the specific approaches, I'm only going to talk about one as an example. Let's take intercultural group work as an example. Each article interpreted intercultural group work in quite a different way or focused on a different dimension. So we have here cooperative learning, collaborative learning, the use of material artifacts, and participatory pedagogies are falling under this broader category. But again, in each case, we only have one or at best two examples. So we have a real challenge in terms of doing what we set out to do, which is to achieve a synthesis and to say, here's how you can use technology enhanced practice with international students in the UK, here's what's been done before, because what we actually have is a very disparate collection of different approaches to technology enhanced practices. I'm going to move on and not talk through all of these details because we will be here all day. I can, but I won't. So yeah, very scattered, very challenging to synthesize. In a lot of cases, there was also a lack of detail about the pedagogy and about the methodology and about the context. So we raise this as an issue because if the aim of publishing pedagogy literature is to enhance practice in the field, then it's essential that people can read it and understand what lessons they are to take away. In order for them to do that effectively, they need to have appropriate contextual information and appropriate levels of detail about the pedagogy. Obviously, there are publication constraints. We've all had the challenge of getting our articles down to the appropriate word count. But this is a bit of a challenge in terms of pushing this field further in ways that are methodologically sound and also pedagogically sufficiently detailed. So we saw very little use of, and if anyone is listening and in desperate need of research ideas, this is the bullet point to pay attention to. Longitudinal studies, cross-sectional studies, replicated or revalidated studies, studies checking what other people have done and seeing if they work again, or studies that actually built on one another conceptually. In particular, and we need to subject this to a proper citation analysis, we found that there's not much referencing outside beyond the discipline. So an article which explores a technology enhanced practice in application in business, for example, doesn't necessarily explore how this has been applied in history, social sciences, or education. That's an obvious shortcoming because many of those practices will transfer across disciplines fairly straightforwardly, or at least that evidence base should be considered and evaluated systematically. There's also very limited emphasis on research ethics, on inclusive pedagogies, or on interculturality, except in the context of intercultural group work, which often falls into the trap that Jenna described in the introduction of treating students as a cultural resource for the classroom. We also found in a more qualitative analysis that there is a tendency to describe international students as homogeneous. So in the methodology sections, for example, there was often no breakdown of further characteristics. Where this was provided, it was often exclusively in terms of the nationality. So no consideration of intersectionality, for example, of the roles that gender might apply, And it's obviously impossible to deal with all the different interactions of different facets of diversity in a single article. But the tendency to position international students as opposed to home students was apparent in this literature in ways that did surprise us. There was also a tendency to refer to international students as acted upon rather than agentic, with a few notable exceptions. That we read some fantastic articles which explicitly talked about role reversal, about participatory pedagogies, which really sought to position students in a position of power in regards to the classroom and the curriculum and even the institution. But there is still, and this is perhaps disappointing to those who have been in the field for a while, a latent deficit discourse around international students. International students are described as experiencing barriers, challenges, problems and stresses more often than they are described as being capable, able, coping and managing. But this is often in the context of justifying the pedagogic practice. So one of the questions we might ask about pushing this field further is whether we can resist the urge to justify pedagogic innovations by creating a deficit narrative around students. Is it not enough to say that our pedagogy should improve because we can improve it without saying that students have a problem? Or can we frame it so that the blame in that narrative is placed on the learning design or on the institutional context rather than on the student? So it's not really a comprehensive field at the moment. It needs a lot more substantive critical empirical investigation, and ideally to draw in pedagogic theories and critical theories of internationalisation more comprehensively than it currently does, to work in interdisciplinary manners and to develop more rigorous and ambitious research designs. And now I shall hand back to Jenna to talk about stage 2.
Thanks. Right, so with that said, the next stage of our work was looking at interviews with staff members, and we kind of purposefully included this stage because we felt that maybe the published research wasn't showing the full story of what was actually happening in our classrooms across the country. And in that sense, we wanted kind of a deeper feel for lecturers' experiences working with international students and how their practice had been shaped by internationalization. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please, Sylvie. So at this stage, we've completed around 20 interviews. We have a goal of 50 interviews, so we're still looking for participants, and we'll include more information at the end about how you can participate if this is interesting to you. But our criteria was essentially anyone in the UK who teaches on a taught unit with international students. So we were purposefully not including, for example, English for academic purposes or pre-sessional, just in recognition of the different pedagogical approaches in those areas. But we wanted to interview across the disciplines and compare experiences in different disciplines. At the moment, we have an overrepresentation of education and business. So if you're outside of those fields, we'd really love to speak with you. But our interviews focus kind of specifically on teaching practices, pedagogies with international students, and kind of general feels about how the presence of international students has shaped individuals' teaching practices. Yeah, the next slide, please, Sylvie. We'll talk through some of the preliminary findings, but I think just with the caveat that we haven't finished our data collection or conducted a full analysis on this yet, so this is all quite preliminary work. But generally we found, especially outside the education discipline, kind of a sense of loneliness about being deemed the pedagogy person or the internationalization person. So kind of the token person in the department who feels really passionate about developing inclusive teaching practices. But there were several participants who talked about finding themselves struggling to raise awareness or interest of these issues with their colleagues. A second finding was in relation to kind of notions about internationalization or the presence of international students as being just the status quo. So it was part of the lives and the professional practices for many of our participants, and especially for those who were relatively early in their career, and I would count myself within that as well. It was all that they had ever known as lecturers. So in that sense, internationalization had really shaped the teaching careers from the start of many participants rather than changed or impacted or impacted practice partway through. It just was practice in that sense. And there was kind of a reluctance from some participants in many ways to feel like internationalization needed a specific focus because it was just part of the status quo. But at the same time, there were a lot of underlying assumptions about kind of the presence of international students bringing a certain resource into the classroom. And we talked about that with our systematic literature review as well. But in terms of international students offering a diverse perspective or having diverse life experiences that they can bring to the subject that's being taught. But, you know, from my perspective, I felt that many of the participants, you know, beyond stating that, really struggled with articulating how they specifically engage with that within the classroom, or how they develop that ethical inclusion of knowledge, you know, practically within the classroom. There was also recognition about growing critiques about the binary division between home and international students. And in that regard, I think there was a recognition from many of the participants that diversity is more complex than, you know, just international or not international. And that many of the issues impacting upon international students' experiences were similarly important for the home students that they worked with, and vice versa. And I think that's a critique that, you know, if you're in this field, that's something that's been growing in the literature, I think, especially over the past 5 or 10 years, that kind of critical internationalization movement. So I think we were quite pleased to see that engagement from staff members as well. But at the same time, it was recognized by many of the participants that there was often a centralization of support that was often limited specifically to international students, despite, you know, those challenges with that binary. For example, support for writing or language at many of the universities tended to be provided solely through the Language Center. It was often specifically aimed at international students or not even available for home students. So we were seeing a lot of the participants kind of bringing in support from those centers at the start of the semester, maybe for induction or a one-off session. But then, you know, as the semester went on, just kind of encouraging students to seek support from other departments rather than kind of building in that those skills or support into the module itself. And I think in that regards, there was often a feeling that there wasn't sufficient space to develop that more authentically within the semester, which then promoted that sort of centralization. And then finally, there was a lot of discussion about witnessing outdated or racist language within departments or from their colleagues. The term Oriental is one example that several participants mentioned. And generally, I think several participants talked about the lack of criticality and kind of a general othering of international students, or discussions, you know, with a presence of a deficit narrative in discussions within the department about supports that are needed for international students. But those perspectives seem to be relatively uneven, as there were other interviewees who felt that, especially you know, in more recent years, there had been a developing you know, an inclusive ethos in a way among their colleagues towards international students. I'll hand back to Sylvie now.
So in terms of the teaching approaches, what is quite interesting at this point is it looks as though there's quite a lot of commonality across across the teaching approaches. So a lot of interviewees are highlighting the importance of setting up equality within the teaching, trying to break down different barriers, and in particular to break down hierarchies of perceived power by, for example, inviting senior leaders in the field to comment and encouraging students to interact and mingle with them in relaxed settings. This has been explicitly framed by at least 4 of the people I've spoken to as trying to set up a space where knowledge is shared equally and co-constructed. Most of the teaching is described as being oriented around activities and tasks. So there's a very strong active learning, student-centered narrative coming through. People are describing their teaching in terms of it being snappy, rapid fire. If they have to lecture, then it's quick chunks of 20 minutes, followed by a task, followed by another chunk. And that's been quite consistent across most of the people, at least that I've spoken to so far. Although I will refer you back to Jenna's caveat about we have not done the proper analysis yet. Several people have talked about infrastructure as being an enabler and a barrier to creative pedagogies. Things that are as simple as what your timetable looks like and what your slot is and what classroom you're scheduled in can really restrict what you're able to do. Are you able to move the tables around in a given room, or are they static? Can you actually structure a lecture theatre for small group work? These questions seem very basic, but they actually have profound implications for what happens in the classroom and for the knowledge that is constructed therein. Someone even mentioned the buildings and the architecture, the tone that's set by hosting an MBA course, for example, in a specific building. I'm not singling out the University of Manchester here, but there are often snazzy buildings associated with executive education that have more flexible learning spaces than are necessarily available to other disciplines. Creating common ground and reference points was often discussed as a strategy for getting over the challenges of interculturality in terms of cultural difference. So rather than asking students to bring their knowledge into the classroom, although that was often spoken of as a value, they're talking about sharing something which they assume nobody knows and using that as the starting point for discussion. So that the sharing is to do with interacting with the same points of reference, the same points of information. Several people have talked about the importance of authentic assessment and of collaborative or participatory design. So authentic assessment means using assessment formats that are relevant to the profession or a specific context, rather than standardized academic formats such as an essay. Where people were able, rather than referring out to centralised services, they emphasised that it is really useful to embed skills that are often seen as generic, such as referencing, using literature, avoiding plagiarism, critical thinking. They talked about how important it was to develop that within a disciplinary context, so that critical thinking in law might look very different from critical thinking in business. From a lot of these teachers, there's a real sense of curiosity about intercultural experiences and also about the different personal trajectories that students bring into the classroom. So a lot of teachers were very careful to highlight that they try not to think about international students or students from this country are like this. They're trying to avoid and overcome stereotypes rather than replicate them. And one of the ways that they try to do that is by emphasizing different people's experiences and knowledges on a personal trajectory rather than treating people as a national or a cultural representative. There were a number of barriers to pedagogical innovation that people have highlighted, in particular a lack of departmental or institutional buy-in. As Jenna highlighted in the first slide of these findings, the feeling of being isolated in the department, of being a sole pedagogical person, means it can be challenging to share those innovations and those considerations with a wider team. I'm sure I hardly need to mention workload, time and energy, particularly at this time of year. And I should say we're hugely grateful to the people who have spared the time in the last 6 weeks to participate. It's a huge vote of confidence and generosity, because everyone is stretched to about 150% at the moment. Massification and rising student numbers have been highlighted in a number of areas, particularly in those institutions which recruits big numbers of international students. In certain disciplines, they're often concentrated. And with limited control at the departmental level and economic pressures from institutions, numbers can create a barrier to being more creative pedagogically. There's often limited training specific to internationalisation and specific to international students. Some of the training has been spoken about quite disparagingly as replicating stereotypes, in particular trainings on Chinese education, which are a good 20 years out of date, have been given as examples. A lot of the time, departments and sometimes colleagues see innovations for internationalisation as soft or compromising quality. And this is a serious perception problem. So for example, introducing a form of authentic assessment can be seen as an easy option relative to a standard academic essay. Our participants have been clear that they absolutely don't see it that way and would actually argue it was harder to do a good job of those forms of assessment types. But again, it's a perception issue. Outsourcing support to other departments rather than facilitating it being delivered in a disciplinary context. I think we've already mentioned this. And a lack of perceived alignment between inclusive education agendas that are targeted at non-traditional or marginalised groups in the home context and internationalisation. So several participants have said to me something along the lines of, it's just good teaching. But the motivations for internationalisation are not seen as being institutionally aligned with the widening participation narratives and the narratives around inclusive education and inclusive pedagogy, or universal design, for example. Those aren't seen as meshing together, and that's creating a challenge for people who are invested in the pedagogy and in pedagogical innovation. Shall I hand back to you, Jenna?
Yeah, so I think we'll just close with a few invitations. So first, as we noted before, we're still looking for interview participants, especially if you are outside of education or business field. I mentioned our third step of our research is to develop a set of case studies of different pedagogic practices. They are really short. I'll just add these links into the chat as well. They're really short, 200 to 300 words, talking about a pedagogic innovation that you've done with international students and a little bit of a reflection about what has gone well and what has not gone well. And we're hoping to create that into a searchable database on our project website, so that lecturers, across the disciplines, if they would like to, find a particular kind of innovation with international students, that's a resource that they can come to. So I've put into the chat a link to a Google Sheet where we have collated names of people who might be interested in joining our network. For example, receiving more information about our research as it gets more finalized. We're also hoping to do things like hold a project workshop maybe in the spring, so getting you signed up to be in the loop on that. But if you're interested in conducting a case study for our website or for taking part in an interview, you can also mark that on the sheet there. Sylvie, if you want to go to the next slide. And then the final thing that we'll share is our project website, which right now is a little bit bare bones, but that's where our case studies will all be housed eventually. So I put that into the chat as well for you to take a look at. But I think, Sylvie, unless you have something else to add, I think we'll stop there. And I see there's a number of really amazing questions in the chat. So we look forward to answering those.
Thanks, Jenna and Sylvie. Magnificent presentation. It's so articulate and so clear, and many things there. It's disappointing to see that. I worked with a large group of people in Melbourne 10 years ago on the International Student Security Study, and disappointing to see the literature hasn't moved on much, Sylvie, since then. Although you're way ahead of us in terms of your discussion of the pedagogy, the scholarship has got a bit of catching up to do, certainly to you and to the needs. And this really brings me to my question. I'll start with a question. There's a raft of questions to follow. The English language countries really are dominant in international student mobility, international education, much more so than they are, say, at the level of political economy on a world scale, or in any other respect, really. It's just educational hegemony is quite startling, and I think it's going to persist for quite a lot longer than the shift of power to the east and the south and so on that's occurring. And it's something about language and culture that's got tremendous gravitational sort of inertia. It doesn't change as fast as economies and mobility and those kinds of things do. So we have this situation where your excellent critical intercultural reflexivity, this way in which you're approaching this very intellectually powerful way you're approaching internationalization issues is really just a reflexivity within the dominant group. And what we're not seeing yet is enough research criticism coming from elsewhere in the world, outside the English language group. so what can, I mean, and I think in a small way in these webinars, we hope to provide a medium in which we can bring in people who are doing work like you're doing, but doing it in East Asia or Latin America or Africa, South Asia. But, you know, we've identified a little bit of that, but we don't know enough about what's going on. I mean, how can we build agency in the research community outside the hegemonic countries that'll create a more symmetrical discussion about these issues, which you're quite rightly focused on in a critical fashion?
Can I have a first stab at that?
Yes.
Morass of different issues? I think that I would twist the issue slightly back on you, Simon, if you don't mind, because I think that the English language speaking countries and ex-colonial centres, it's precisely because of the hegemonic power that this is where we need to have this pedagogic discussion, because there's an assumption that because of our history, therefore our education is of a superior quality, and that's why we get to recruit students, in addition to the political legacy. And I think our question is basically, are we living up to that, given that we have internationalised classrooms? I think in many ways, the traditional pedagogies of the UK were appropriate for a 1960s population of grammar school educated white boys. Are they appropriate to a contemporary student population? And have we adapted to the conceptual and the epistemic issues that raises? And I'm drawing a lot on Annetta Hayes' concept of epistemic inclusion here. So I agree, I think it's super important, and I don't think we've thought yet about how we can set up those relationships and ask these questions with people with pedagogues in other areas of the world, partly because I think it's incumbent on those who are doing the bulk of the recruiting to have this question internally and this reflection internally first. That's an ethical responsibility for international student recruitment.
I totally agree with you. But 30 years of being post-colonial in the UK hasn't changed the neo-colonial relationships very much at all. So there's a problem there, and I think it's not in the outlook and the practice of those who are post-colonial. The problem, of course, is the way in which that is so easily absorbed into the existing relationships as a sort of critical but interface of the dominant group. So the only way you correct that problem is you link up to agency outside the dominant group, so that building agency outside is really important, and contributing to that, but really just also facilitating it when it appears. And so I think we probably need to do more on that, because it if you like, it keeps us honest too, and ensures that we don't become just a way in which we can make international student market more palatable to the people who are consuming it, you know, which is sort of what we're doing a lot of the time at the moment. Let me start on the great questioner list. I'm going to ask Alison Leslie and Anna Garland to come in first, and both ask their questions before we answer them. So, because they're similar questions. So can we bring in Alison first? Alison Leslie.
Hi, I'm Alison Leslie. I'm a lecturer in English for academic purposes at the University of Leeds. So this is very, very much my bread and butter. I'm fascinated to know sort of what you would suggest then in terms of those of us who are having to, you know, live this every day in our work, in terms of how do we challenge the negative discourse that is used perhaps by our colleagues. I'm in a situation where I'm seconded to a school where I'm doing academic literacy, which is embedded in the discipline, which is a very fortunate position to be in. But the conversations I have with colleagues then about how do I best support them, because I try to put the onus on supporting them rather than the students, it always comes back to this idea of, oh, well, the international students or the Chinese students have problems with X. So I'm just wondering if you have any practical solutions on how we address that. And also if you have an alternative to also this binary distinction between international and home students. I noticed, I may have missed it, you didn't classify exactly what you meant by international students, or are you just picking up on any literature that uses that term? Are we talking about non-UK? Are we talking about non-EU? are we talking about language 2 students?
Thanks very much, Alison. And Anna Garland, can you come in with your question too?
Hi, yes, I'm Anna Garland. I come from this from 2 perspectives. First of all, I'm a recent academic. I came into higher education a few years ago from a practitioner background. So I am a lawyer by training, now teaching law. And I have just volunteered as a responsibility for coordinating, sort of looking at internationalisation across the faculty within which I work. And then when I'm not doing that in the day job, I'm doing my EdD, which is a post-colonial narrative inquiry into the experiences of students, mainly from the Gulf states, but from the wider Middle East, when encountering Western academic discourse in the UK. And one of the things that I'm very much wrestling with, and Sylvie and Jenna's work sort of more generally is one of the things that helped me to sort of first come to grips with this, but I've still not found a satisfactory approach, is this. On the one hand, you know, taking a post-colonial and it's a discursive post-structuralist theoretical approach, you know, I want to be challenging that deficit discourse. But on the other hand, taking a narrative approach, obviously I need to be focusing on the language and the framing of the experiences from my knowledge holders, from the students who are kind enough to contribute their ideas to my research. And so where I'm at the moment is trying to, you know, walk that tightrope by using the language that the students are using, which is, you know, emerging in a lot of the literature, which tends to be more deficit orientated around barriers, challenges, problems, whilst at the same time wondering whether I'm doing enough by saying, well, you know, if we look at those barriers as being something which has been deliberately or otherwise constructed by the academy, and that they are for students a real thing, they are a real part of their genuine experience. And if by challenging that deficit discourse but still using the language, you know, is it doing enough, or is it falling into the trap of, you know, by even using that language, I'm somehow colluding with that deficit? It's something I'm wrestling with on a daily basis at the moment. So I just really appreciate some insights into what other people think about it.
Thanks, Anna. It's very thoughtful. Sylvie and Jenna, responses to both those fulsome and interesting questions.
Yeah, those are great questions. Shall I do this one first, Sylvie? No, I think what you're both asking are difficult questions, and I think we could have a whole lifetime's worth of work trying to answer them. But I mean, I think some general guidelines, I think it starts with self-reflection and recognizing where within our own thinking does this deficit narrative come from, and where are we assuming a deficit of skills or a deficit of knowledge in our work with international students. So I think it's really hard to develop that, you know, in our research or in our wider departments before we look at that internally. But I think, you know, Alison, in terms of your question about working with staff, I think we have to call it out when we see it. And that's hard because we want to be collegial. But I think when we get into those conversations and we hear those assumptions about international students and deficit discourses about their skills or knowledges, I think we have to say something to say, well, where is that assumption coming from? Are you sure that that is something that is true to international students' experiences? Aren't you making a bit of an assumption there? And again, I think that's only something I felt comfortable in doing maybe in the last year. And I think that's really hard in our professional practice. I think that, Anna, in terms of your question, I think there's maybe 2 questions to think about. I think first we have to think about, is the disaggregation of students meaningful? When we're thinking about support for international students, is there a reason why we're only talking about international students? Or is this a support system that can be helpful for inclusivity in our broader student population? So a lot of, for example, the supports that we offer international students are actually inclusive practices for other groups of students. And so I think we have to think critically about, why are we disaggregating that group? But I'm going to flip it around on the other side. Is I think we also need to be thinking about the intersectionality and diversity of international students. So when I hear people talk about Chinese international students, for example, we're talking about a country of 1 billion people with, I mean, I think there's, you know, dozens of recognized ethnic minority groups, dozens of regional language variations. So we can't talk about China as a monolith in that sense. I think we also have to think about intersectionality of international students' experiences, in the sense that it's not just about nationality. Issues like gender gender, ethnicity, race, things like disability status will all impact upon students' experiences. And we see that intersectionality with our home students. But I think we tend to mute that when it comes to talking about the international student experience. And so in that sense, I think we have to stop thinking about the homogenization of the international student experience, because that doesn't exist. I don't know if that answered the question, but Sylvie, you probably have more to say on that.
I could talk forever, but it's such a complicated issue. But just to Anna, it sounds as if you're doing as much as possible to get over the deficit discourse, and it sounds like a great project that you're doing. I think that it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation within the discourse while also still being critical of the discourse. And we have to some extent, use the labels and the groups that are meaningful. And this touches on Alison's other question in the chat, have we found a more inclusive label to use rather than international students? Well, no, because this is a framing that's used in policy. It's a framing that's used in institutional documentations. As such, it's meaningful in the same way that the category of biological race is meaningful to the extent that it's used in a census that people identify with a particular ethnic group. But we have to recognize that, like race, that's a socially constructed category. It's not given, it's not innate, it's not meaningful other than the meanings we ascribe to it.
I want to thank both Alison and Anna for their questions. I mean, I found them both really interesting, and it kind of reminded us how that in intercultural discussion, we discover the world, but we discover something new about ourselves all at the same time, and that's really exciting. So when you talked about the dilemmas that you were wrestling with in your work, these are dilemmas that were also personally transformative and highly productive for you, and you gain new insights into yourself, but also insights that you can share with all of us. So, keep on going is the answer, I think. You're on the right track. I'm going to bring in Doria Abdullah, who's doing research on internationalization from Malaysia, which starts to give us some more global symmetry in the discussion. After Doria, we'll have Diana Laurillard and Lynn Newen. I've got further questions, and if we've got time, we'll probably get to Solomon, Gabriel, and Rebecca. The questions from John and Diana I've set aside because they're a little bit off the topic, but if they want to rephrase a question and rejoin the topic a bit more closely, that would also be welcome. But Doria, you have the screen now. Come in, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, right. Thanks. Thanks, Prof. Simon. To Jenna and Sylvie, congratulations. That's a really good research. I'm doing something similar in the context of Malaysia, so this is where my argument would come in. There will be the discourse on homogeneity because the issues that you're putting on in terms of general issues with regard to how international students learn in the classroom and the approaches in teaching, we had similar issues here in Malaysia. So to frame it in terms of every country has its own issues in terms of how teaching is delivered might be a bit more, perhaps you could expand it to an international context. Now, my questions, you have answered it partly just now, but is there this agency from the perspective of the teaching staff to teach better in terms of taking on additional professional development courses, understanding that we cannot separate demographics from teaching practices in the classroom because context matter at the end of the day. Coming from a specific region of the world means you have to consider how these students learn prior to coming to your context. Especially. So if you could comment on that, the mindfulness on the perspective of the staff, especially in terms of training and self-awareness on there should be teaching the international students better based on where they come from and their prior experiences coming prior to the prior to the UK international higher education sector. Thanks. Is the question clear? I mean, too much to ask.
No, those are good questions. Sylvie, any preference on who goes first with this one?
But did we want to take Diana's question at the same time?
Oh, sorry.
There's another question coming in. I mean, or yeah, I'm done.
No,
I'm done.
okay, we'll do yours. Simon, you're muted, just FYI. I was interpreting your gestures.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, I think, Doria, those are really interesting questions, and yeah, I think it would be really interesting to hear about the Malaysian context as a recruiter of international students. I think, so you had two questions. I'll take the one on staff training and hand the other one to Jenna. Yes, there's definitely agency amongst the staff that we interviewed to go and seek out training. This isn't always easy for them to access, and it's of variable quality depending on the institution and varying levels of criticality based on what they've told us. I do think that we are currently getting a sample that is biased in favour of positive attitudes and invest towards international students and investment in pedagogy. I don't think this will necessarily be the case across the board.
And then I guess the second question about the student demographics. I mean, I think I get a sense that a lot of the lecturers that we've interviewed would really love to be able to do this, but are exceptionally limited by time. And as well, I think that there was a tendency for them to have a recognition of, for example, the Chinese system of education or Chinese, approaches to education, because that's overwhelmingly the largest group of international students within the UK, but maybe not as much engagement with some of the other, and Sylvie, correct me if I'm wrong, with some of the interviews you've done, but I think there wasn't too much engagement with students' backgrounds, or ability to build that into the classroom. I think that goes beyond what people felt they had training or time to be able to do.
And I think, can I just add a little bit? I think there is actually an explicit resistance as well to doing that in some cases, and wanting to acknowledge the individual paths rather than the national demographics.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Diana Laurelard.
Hello, and thank you very much for that presentation. I'm delighted you're doing some research on pedagogy, because I'm interested in pedagogy, and to be honest, pedagogy of any kind is pretty thin on the ground as far as research is concerned. So having your focus on the pedagogy of internationalization, fantastic, that's great. And I like your emphasis on the importance of, when you're thinking about inclusivity, taking a positive angle on it, not a deficit angle. And I think that is important, and that should fit very well with decolonizing the curriculum, because there you're explicitly setting out to invite different perspectives on for example, Western thought and so on. So you inculcate a culture in which the whole class is learning from each other, that kind of thing. So, I mean, that's a much more positive way of thinking about it. But I do remember from teaching that there were some clashes or mismatches and student expectations, which I have to say were not confined to international students, of wanting more didactic teaching. And sometimes colleagues can face a sort of rebellion from people saying, you know, don't keep asking us all the time, just tell us. And, you know, that kind of resistance to pedagogies which are trying to inculcate the sense of criticality of thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, innovative approaches, that kind of thing in students. It's important. They have to develop a questioning approach to what they're being taught. So I want to have it both ways. I mean, can we embrace both of those approaches, do you think?
A good question. I mean, I think we have to recognize first that students aren't always the best judge of what is best for their learning. And we know that from research, that students tend to favor teaching or teaching approaches that are easier, not necessarily best for their learning. So I think there's that first. And I think secondly, what really helps with that conversation is bringing students along with the discussion and having open and honest discussion about why certain pedagogies are being used, why certain approaches are being used, and bringing students into the design of the activities as well, so that their preferences and thoughts are included. And there were several research projects within our literature review, for example, that did bring students in with part of the design. So I think my my feeling is we can't just simply go straight to didactic learning, but we need to bring students on board and bring them into that conversation.
That's a good answer, thank you.
And I think that didactic learning can actually also be inclusive, because although I put the emphasis in the summary on the active learning, you'll notice that it was interspersed often with chunks of didactic teaching, but this is broken up. And actually a lot of our participants were talking about you need to have a certain base level of knowledge, and some of that might be most appropriately provided by an element of didactic teaching mediated by active learning, in order to give everyone the same reference point and the same starting point.
Yes, I mean this was not a point against didactic teaching. It was against having it demanded all the time.
Well, Alex, I've got time for one more question, and I will take that question if I can now. Lynn Nguyen, back to the Western Pacific to try and balance the global conversation. Lynn Nguyen, who's from Vietnam but currently studying in Melbourne.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Sylvie and Jenna. Fantastic research. Yes, I'm a Vietnamese PhD student in Melbourne, and I'm very interested in your research and your presentation. And I would like to have the question about the teaching interviewed. You mentioned that the students, the international students in your research are not homogeneous. So how about the interviewed teaching staff? And I know it is still work in progress, but I wonder how culturally and linguistically diverse are they? Thank you.
Good question as well. No, I appreciate you bringing that up, and thanks for joining us during your nighttime as well. I think we do have a good diversity in terms of the staff who were part of our interview group. I would say probably 60 to 70% of them are British, but we do have a number of international staff that were involved as well, and a surprising number as well of British staff who had experiences traveling abroad and had taught abroad before coming back to the UK. And I think that those issues did impact their perspectives on kind of the role of internationalization and their interest in being inclusive to international students having had that international background. But I don't know, Sylvie, do you want to add anything else to that?
No, I think that's right. There is probably an over-representation of white women at the moment, as there is an over-representation from education, and those two things really overlap. But we do have quite a few international staff members included, and most of the people we've interviewed, have had some element of international experience themselves in their biography, which was important for them in terms of understanding how it feels to be different and othered, and setting up the classroom to be a space where that doesn't happen as best they can.
I'm going to have to move to the close, I'm afraid, but I want to thank Sylvie and Jenna for the wonderful discussion today, but really thank you also for approaching us and offering us this topic. I mean, I think it's you're on the cutting edge in the UK, and if I can put on my UK and Oxford hat for a minute, I would like us to develop a larger seminar in the webinar format, which opened up these issues further and drew on a number of institutions. But, you know, I'd like to see you really leading that. So we could perhaps negotiate over that in terms of building a larger discussion than we can do in a 1 hour format, but a discussion which would nevertheless be global and where we might be able to bring in some voices from outside the UK as well. But really, really important work, great work, and I think world important work. Next webinar, which is next Tuesday, we go to the topic of student accommodation, which is very much a hot topic at the moment with the pandemic raging in student accommodation, not only in the UK, but in lots of other countries as well, regrettably. And we'll have a discussion led by, excuse me, Zach Spire and Professor Alexei Marmot from UCL. So do tune in on Tuesday for that discussion. Thanks for taking part today. Thank you for all the questioners and participants. And thank you very much, Sylvie and Jenna, for a wonderful presentation and discussion. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.